My first question is for Hilary. I would love it if you could say a little bit about, so you've done a lot of interesting writing and thinking about the sort of social networks and this, like the inequality of who we know, and you know, how our embeddedness in different kinds of social relations is almost asset-like. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about, you know, how you think the idea of property and ownership might sort of overlay on that kind of inequality.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think it goes to sort of also what Indy was saying about commons, because of course it isn't that we kind of go and look at a model of a cooperative and a common and we say, let's have that now. It's that we think, like, what is the kind of, what's the idea in that across different societies, and how do we deeply reinvent that now? And obviously one of those is about relationships. And so I think that you know, the sort of the traditional lens, because it's so transactional, is like, you know, how do we connect person A to person B? So a really good, you know, a lot of my work is in care, and a really good example of this would be, you know, like person X is lonely, let's have a loneliness service to connect person A to person B, rather than thinking like what is already in that ecosystem and how do we kind of rejoin it together, which is much more the kind of work that I'm doing. I think what's really interesting now in the kind of work that I'm doing is that people are talking instinctively. I mean, obviously, you know, Indy's operating at kind of 50,000 feet, but I'm kind of like in there on the ground, and people are talking instinctively about care and repair together, like how do we bring those relationships of kind of the kind of expanses in which we live, the kind of urban areas in which we live, into that same kind of thinking about how we relate to one another. So, you know, in these kind of new forms of union that people have kind of created from nothing on the tablecloths, that people are thinking about that kind of deep interrelationship. They're not thinking about their cars. I think that's a kind of really, really interesting. That has never come up, and I think that's really interesting, but kind of thinking in this way. But also, if I can just say, I think that one of the, you know, the metaphor in my work is to sort of be a new horizontalist. I mean, that everything we have is very, very vertical. We've kind of like, you know, we've been educated, all of us, in those kind of industrial kind of systems. And now the thing is, you know, like, who was it? You had that beautiful slide that made everything kind of rotate. But so the thing is now, like, how can we be kind of horizontal? How do we kind of really make those connections in a meaningful, everyday praxis? You know, like, what's the kind of cathexis that moves from, wow, that's a kind of interesting idea, to like, yes, we're now living in that way. And I guess that what I'm kind of designing are systems that make that behavior that people already want kind of natural and part of the everyday.
Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff that you've done that I find quite inspiring is just thinking about how to sort of like operationalize a way of restructuring these networks between people. So, for example, you know, the old model of like unemployment might be sort of, you know, a central node referring everyone to jobs, but you've thought about like other ways of kind of connecting people to one another in this more horizontal.
Yeah, or maybe with older people, because I think the traditional ownership model is a scarcity model, isn't it? It's like everything is scarce, we better kind of, you know, grab that in exactly the way that Indy was describing and kind of have dominion over it. And so, but also kind of one of the things that you know, sort of driving force of the work I do is what would happen if things got stronger and more abundant. The more we kind of use them, the more we're part of them. So thinking about how that works with older people, for example, definitely thinking how that works in employment as a kind of idea that then structures a completely different kind of approach to what people might find in an employment service. And of course it works. The data shows it's kind of like, it really works.
Yeah. So, and Hilary, you should feel free to ask questions to Indy as well. But I guess my first question is just when you think about like, I mean, the idea of an object owning itself. You know, there are a couple questions there. You know, one is you know, how do you represent and operationalize the sort of the agency of the object? And but I think another one is the legitimacy of it, right? So how do you if you come up with a way of making a camera or a house own itself and act in its own agent-like way in the world, how do you ensure the legitimacy of it, right? How do we know that the camera, you know, should own itself?
It's a great question, but I would say that existing cameras have a lack of legitimacy in themselves right now. So start with the kind of a camera is largely a tool of surveillance, whether it's surveillance state or surveillance markets. They're actually both increasingly problematic. So the idea of any form of kind of centralized control is becoming an asymmetric extractive system. And the way we're designing these technologies are entirely capitalized for extractive control theory. So the question has to be ordered at 2-3 different levels. How do you actually break agency up and actually start to create agency at the kind of almost the lowest unit of level? And then how do you actually build technologies which are fundamentally through a life-affirming framework? And I think what we've reached is a kind of really culturally interesting point. And if you look back at history, you look back at places like Japan and even here, right, in the UK, the role of fairies, there was a whole imagination of mischievous things. And I think we're living in a moment where these animist realities are starting to creep back in, and our bureaucratic capacities are being imagined. So we're just starting a piece of work on how do you reimagine an energy meter to be self-sovereign, but actually acting as an agent in the system. So you'd no longer have institutions that are governing these frameworks, but actually powerful agents, which are actually institutional agents for fairness in the system. So I think this re-agentification of the world, and there is a question about how you code them, how you actually open them up, how you open them up for new scrutiny. But I think that's part of the exploration. So I wouldn't say this is where, this is a done deal, but I think this is a powerful pathway to actually organizing power in different ways and actually re-agentifying the world. And I think we've got historic precedents to learn from, but they're going to be rhyming with that, but not necessarily expanding it.
Could you say a little bit more about the work that you and your colleagues have done in terms of how concretely a non-human thing represents itself in the world, like how it speaks?
So not everything is about speaking directly. I think that's one thing. And I think one thing I'll point to is Shu's work on a river in Taiwan. One of the big kind of revelations, we were all catching up in Berlin a week ago, that we often talk about rights of nature through the constitution of the legal entity of the river itself. And actually, as soon as you start to do that, you create the problem of you re-centralize a theory of power and control. Whereas if you don't go through actually the legal rights of the river, but you go through how you relate to the river, and you change your theory of interface with the river and the governance of that interface, that opens up a fundamentally different way of actually an emergent relationship model. So your governance theory isn't about the object orientation, it's the relationship orientation, which I think is a paradigm leap in how we think about governance and object-oriented governance. So I think there's something interesting in the exploration which will change the nature. I think we're still looking at objects, but I think it's more the relationships that will be formed and the governance of those relationships in radical new ways. Again, I would point you to people like Calvin, Shu, Fang, and other people in the room who are doing a lot of this work as part of that conversation.
Super. Do either of you have questions for one another?
I'd like to talk about care. Because I think one of the really brilliant pieces of work, Hilary, that you've done is looking at the kind of expansion of care. And I would argue that as we move into a multi-agent society and a mass multi-agent society, care, and especially in an entangled world, care as a means of operating and being becomes actually a really fundamental way of being, both from humans to humans, but humans to non-human systems. And how do we start to think about these modalities of care in complex entanglements and the way of being in that? How do we even code some of that stuff into institutions? And just as a thought, because I think you've been leading this field for such a long time around that.
I think that's a really interesting question. And when you said, Indy, about we don't want to work. I mean, you didn't quite. You didn't exactly say that. What did you say?
Beyond theories of labour.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess the question back to you would be could we put care into that in some different form? Why is everybody laughing?
We don't want to work. I think I got everyone smiling. I think where I was going with the labour thing is labour is an idea of instrumentalisation of being human.
Exactly. And so could we use care as a way to kind of, because one of the things, again, when you look in revolutions is, art is a really good example. Art was not a thing, and suddenly kind of technology of paints, of scaffolding, of kind of excess money enabled artists to move from craftsmen to these kind of very rich individual people. And so I think, care as well is could we make it move in all directions? Could it happen? Because obviously one thing that has to happen is we have to kind of revalue that work, just as we kind of, it can go backwards. Most of the artists I work with say that everything has gone backwards. We unfortunately are not, 16th century wealthy people. But anyway, could we kind of move and challenge the work of care, but also could we use that care work to challenge the very idea of work and kind of like, where, well, I mean, Elon Musk today, we're not going to work. I mean, again, the boys cry robot, but, like what is a kind of deeper meaning in that and that kind of activity, which also is about hand, heart and body, isn't it, in a way that work in a traditional sense is not, and is why we reject it.
I suppose the big arc I really want to put down is I think labor as an idea needs to be killed, right? Labor is an extension of a theory of enslavement. And if we can replace a theory of labor to actually how do we create societies built on care, the being of care in the world, and emancipation of humans to be radically human, the freedom to be human, not the freedom to consume, but rooted in the kind of, how do we get the politics of a new economy rooted not in theories of labor, to be in care and to be radically human? That, I think, is a level of emancipation this 21st century society needs. And it's rooted in reimagining all these things at root level, which is why I think this conversation is so critical. So.
Well, I agree, and I think, like Aristotle, he says that life should be lived unleisurely. I mean, a lot of the kind of stuff that's come out of the workshops that I've been doing and the imaginations is about play, and it's like such a weird, it's like so clunky to hear it, like life should be lived as unleisurely, because we would be talking about how to take work out of the equation, not, and so it's like, how could we really shift that fulcrum to kind of an idea of kind of, I mean, I don't know, like for me, I'm working with this idea of sapiens integra and how we kind of integrate in kind of all forms, but like I say, I haven't got the car or the camera in my form, so I kind of think there's a stage further to go.
Super. Thank you so much. It's a great place to stop. And let me make a quick remark that there's no audience questions right now, but the reason for that is we're hoping to create just as many pent up questions in your mind and topics to explore as possible, which can all be unleashed in a radically interactive second part of the day. So thank you.